Welcome to the Clutch Kitten Gaming Podcast, where I play an indie game for 5 hours and let you know whether or not it's worth your time and money. Hello and welcome. This is James, also known as Clutch Kitten, and I am so glad you guys are here to join me for episode 14. What a week it's been already. It was like 40 degrees when I went to work the other day. The leaves were dropping like flies, and it finally feels like fall. I just want to say that I'm so blessed by the support I've received from you guys and the friends I've made through the podcast and also Instagram, where so many other gamers and creators are at. If you're looking for ways to continue supporting the podcast, definitely don't forget to subscribe on whatever platform you listen on. And if you enjoy the content I'm putting out, please consider leaving a 5-star review on iTunes, Spotify, Podchaser, or wherever else you found the podcast. So if you haven't heard about it already, let me inform you about this week's story. I pulled some of this information from Megan Nicolette's article on The Verge, but there's information pretty much everywhere about this on most gaming publications. On Friday, September 21st, 250 employees of Telltale were told that they were being laid off out of nowhere with no severance pay and only 9 more days of health insurance. If you haven't heard of Telltale Games before, they're the ones who kind of revitalized the adventure game genre back with The Walking Dead Season 1. They've created a lot of episodic licensed adventure games, basically from The Walking Dead to Batman to Guardians of the Galaxy and even Minecraft now. I personally haven't played any of these games, but I've watched plenty of them being played and they seem super interesting. The issue that I've heard though is that they haven't really iterated on their tech or the genre within Telltale. And I think this gigantic layoff is pretty indicative that something went wrong. Apparently they had this layoff meeting and told the employees to pack up and be out of the office in the next 30 minutes. It seems like so many people are jumping on this story because it's such a terrible example of how volatile a lot of these game industry jobs are. This is for sure on the bad end, laying off that many employees with no severance and insurance only to last through the end of that month. Part of the controversy as well was that there was talk of continuing and finishing out the final season of The Walking Dead with external contractors. I'm not sure if it's been confirmed or not, but it's sad to see such a disregard from an employer to all their past employees, not giving them any severance. In my mind, even if they didn't have the money, someone was in charge of all of this wild mismanagement. It sounds like a bunch of potential investors dropped out last minute, which probably was the straw that broke the camel's back. But to me, if they were relying so heavily on these investments, something should have been done differently earlier on. Needless to say, this was a tragic series of events, but my hope is that it creates dialogue around the issue and maybe prevents it from happening in the future. Now that we have the news out of the way, let's flatten out our perspective and take all that color out of the world and look at our game for this week, Minit. This week's game is called Minit, M-I-N-I-T, and is a 2D adventure game. It was released on April 3rd, 2018, and developed by a group of individuals. Bear with me as I most likely mispronounce all these names. The first of which is Jan Willem Niemann, who's actually the co-founder of Vlambeer, which made games I've played like Nuclear Throne and a couple Serious Sams. The second person is Kitty Callis, who actually contributed to Horizon Zero Dawn. Third, we have Yukio Kallio, who is a freelance composer, who actually also did music for Nuclear Throne and some of the B-side tapes for Celeste. Lastly, there is Dominic Johan, who's the art director at a studio called Crows. They all seem to be located in different areas of Europe, spanning from Germany to the Netherlands, but it's pretty cool that they all collaborated on this one project. Minit currently costs $9.99 on Steam, and I'm guessing it's a very similar price on other platforms. According to HowLongToBeat.com, the main story takes about an hour and a half, and if you're a completionist, the game can take around 3.5 hours. I'm not quite sure if that includes the New Game Plus, but I would imagine that it does. This game plays with both gamepad and mouse and keyboard, and although I love mouse and keyboard, when there's games that work well with a controller, I often just use that since I can sit back and relax when I'm at my desk. As a result, I used my Xbox controller and it worked great for the most part, but if all you have is mouse and keyboard, that should work just as well. Let's transition now into the story. Have you ever been asked what you would do if you only had 24 hours left to live? Well, what if you only had 60 seconds left to live? Would you go and water your garden? Would you grab a sword and kill some snakes? Would you run to the beach, jump on a boat, and sail away? Luckily for you, you don't need to test this out for yourself, because in Minit, the protagonist is cursed with a life that is lived only 60 seconds at a time, and you get to experience exactly what that's like. This game is set on a coastline in a fantasy universe and has quite a few different land types. There's caves, deserts, rivers, and an island that you'll get to sail to. I don't believe there was any talk of when the game is set, but there's a mixture of old and new equipment. For example, you use a watering can and a sword, but you also receive a camera at some point. The timeline is very confusing, but I guess that's about what you should expect in a world where your life lasts 60 seconds at a time. You are the primary character in this game, and you're a weird person duck looking dude. And if this game gives you a name, I really do not remember what it is. Other than your guy, there aren't really other characters that you spend a significant amount of time with. As we'll talk about later, although you're free to roam around the map, there really aren't many reasons to revisit NPCs, the non-playable characters, if you've already solved the puzzle relating to them. The main point in this game is to explore, meet new people, and figure out what the hell is up with dying every 60 seconds. Although your character seems to put up with it pretty well, I'm sure at some point they were super frustrated with being reset to their house so freaking often. One theme I'll return to again is that of deliberate simplicity. The developers of this game kept everything from the story to the mechanics to the art so simple so that they could focus on what they believed was most important. As such, the way you learn about the story and build the world is simply by exploring. You see new places, meet new people, and everything you do expands your perception of the world that the developers built. There are a few NPCs which speak to you, but there isn't ever a conversation. Your character doesn't speak, but only sees what the person says in a little text box. What's funny is that in one case, there's this old man you meet who speaks incredibly slow. The game portrays his slow speech by scrolling the text very slowly as well. And what's comical about the interaction with the old man is that if you want to hear all that he has to say, it basically takes up your entire minute of time. If you don't book it over to where he's at, you'll literally die before he finishes his sentence. When I was playing that part, I was just imagining the developers cracking up as they made it. So the story is simple, but how is the quality of writing, and is it even important to the game? There's so little writing that it's really hard to judge, but what I can say is that the world building is nice. It's not elaborate or shocking, but it feels intentional. That's always one difficulty when I'm reviewing a procedurally generated game such as Bunker Punks. It's so much harder to feel like those maps reach a high tier of quality because they aren't handcrafted. But with games like Minit, where every piece of the map is created for a specific purpose, the world and narrative is built in a much more convincing and natural way. Minit builds a nice world for us, but the narrative is pretty unimportant to the game. That's one area that I think could have been improved in my opinion. When I got to the final boss, I honestly didn't know who he was or why I was even fighting him. At least for my playthrough, there really wasn't a build-up tension as I looked to break the curse I carried. Let's move on now to gameplay. What I think is incredibly creative about this game is how the developers made a mechanic which allowed them to keep the world small without making you feel like it is small. Let's explore the 60-second mechanic a little bit more so that I can explain my point a little bit more fully. Every time you spawn, there's a 60-second countdown at the top left of your screen. It doesn't wait until you're outside your house or until you reach a checkpoint. The timer starts right away. You can choose to run whatever direction you want, but the constant in the game is that when your timer gets down to 0, you drop dead and respawn at your house. There are a few locations throughout the map which actually allow you to move your home base. That changes your respawn point when you die, but you still always die after a minute. What I think is so clever about this is that it let the developers scope their work around the mechanic. Instead of having to create artificial walls around the map, the developers could just figure out how far you as a player could go within 60 seconds and expand the map just a bit further than that. As a result, I never saw the edge of the map, and it made me feel like the game was much more expansive than I'm sure it actually was. Before we jump into some other specific mechanics, I want to address some worries I had coming into the game specifically tied to this mechanic. The first worry I had was that the timer would stress me the hell out. In my daily life, I think a lot in metrics of time, but the thought of dying every 60 seconds did not appeal to me at first. What I realized though when I started playing was that this mechanic forced a design that really wasn't stressful. Because the developers knew you could only get so far in one run, the key to whatever your next puzzle is guaranteed to be within 60 seconds. There were some puzzles that made you change your home base before you could get an item that you needed for a puzzle, but the game was designed so that you could always make progress in a single run. Whether that progress was changing your home base, whether it was running out and killing a few people for a quest, whatever it was, you could always do something in that 60 seconds. It took that sense of stress away because I knew I could progress in that time, whereas in some games, you have to talk to 5 people, backtrack through a cave, and find an item before you can even complete a puzzle, and by the time all that's done, you're 2 hours deep in the game. The second main concern I had was that if I didn't complete a puzzle before I died, they would reset. If you're having that same concern, hopefully I can help alleviate that worry. If you pick up an item and then die, you'll have that item when you respawn. In one instance, to obtain an item, you have to find 4 or 5 people. Say you find 3 of the people and then you die, you don't have to re-find those 3 people again once you respawn, you just need to find the remaining 2. There are a few things that will reset between runs, but I never felt cheated out of my progress. If I ever died before getting something done, it always felt like my fault and not like the game was trying to screw me over. Let's take a look now at what you'll be doing besides walking and dying. A lot of people are calling this a Zelda-like game because of the exploration and puzzle solving you'll be doing. Just like a lot of other adventure games, as you find and unlock new abilities and items, new locations and puzzles open themselves up and naturally let you progress. Let's look at a few of the items you'll be getting. The first is a sword. I mean, what would a game be without a trusty sword? It does pretty much exactly what you imagine. It allows you to kill enemies that are blocking your way, or chop down trees that need to go. The second item you get is a watering can. I actually think the only other games I've gotten watering cans in are Harvest Moon and Stardew Valley, so it was weird getting it in an adventure game, but Minit really has some creative puzzle solving that you can do with the watering can. The game also has some secrets, like if you water a plant in your field a few times, run after run, you'll get an additional heart. The last item I'll talk briefly about is your camera. It allows you to convince an NPC that you're part of the press so that you can access a new area. There might also be some other things that it allows you to do, but that was the only one I actually found. There are a few other items, including water shoes and some faster boots, which I actually never got to by the end of the game. But in addition to those, there are a few abilities you'll unlock as the game moves on, including the ability to push boxes and toss your sword kind of like a boomerang. What I think is most important to focus on is the fact that Minit gives a really nice variety of ways to solve puzzles. Although the developers kept the game deliberately simple, they allowed for some more difficult puzzles. Since you can only carry one item at a time, there were often times where I'd leave my house with a sword, only to realize that I needed my watering can, and by the time I realized, it was generally too late. Luckily, the game adds in a suicide button so you don't have to waste your time if you know you're already not going to make it. Let's jump into the art and music now to round out our discussion. Again, the theme of deliberate simplicity shows up when it comes to the art and music. This is a 2D pixel art game that is completely black and white, and it looks awesome. The art is lighthearted and a little bit funky, which is a boon to the adventure game in my opinion. In my mind, the two pillars of excellent pixel art are Celeste and the Red Strings Club. The way the artists for those games used such an inherently minimalistic art style to convey such powerful images was crazy to me, and the color palette of those games was also on point. With that in mind, I like to judge other pixel art games by the same standard, and I think Minit holds up well. Obviously, since it's black and white, I can't praise the amazing color design, but I can praise the choice to simplify the art in that way. The game looked clean, and it was beautiful in its own way. When it comes to music, Minit really didn't stand out to me. The music was adequate, but it didn't feel all that special. It was actually a surprise to me when I saw the composer also worked on Celeste, because that soundtrack was amazing. But this music didn't really feel all that unique. It felt like exactly the music you'd expect from a 2D Zelda-like adventure game. The music evoked a sense of adventure, which was good, but it wasn't a standout aspect of the game to me. Before we get to the final boss, let's summarize the positives and negatives. On the positive side, the developers created a high-quality adventure experience and didn't overstep their bounds. All too often, you see independent developers trying to create something beyond their ability. So many games get lost in the depths of Kickstarter because someone had higher hopes than the funding and their skill would allow. You see first-time developers trying to create a game to compete with AAA titles, only to realize how difficult that is. That's why, in my opinion, Minit is such a great game. The core 60-second mechanic was an ingenious decision, which is backed up by nice art, fun gameplay, and an overall great 2.5-hour experience. On the negative side, the game could have been improved in two areas. First, I would have liked a little bit more attention to the story. As I mentioned earlier, when I got to the boss, it was a little anticlimactic. The world was a great baseline of story building, but there just needed to be a touch more narrative added. Second, the music game could have been kicked up a notch. The music wasn't bad, but it wasn't memorable to me. That's what separates amazing from mediocre to me. The soundtrack from Celeste and Moonlighter are still stuck in my head weeks and months later, but I can't remember a single tune from Minit at this point. We've made it to the final boss. This is the part of the podcast where I let you know whether you should slay the game and buy it, flee the game and avoid it, or farm up and wait for a sale. My verdict is to slay the game. If you're craving a Zelda-like game with some unique mechanics, this is definitely the game for you. But even if you aren't, Minit provides a quality gaming experience that is well worth the time. As always, thank you guys so much for tuning in for another episode. Hopefully you're enjoying the time as much as I am. If you want to contact me with questions, comments, critiques, or random news, shoot me an email at clutchkittengaming@gmail.com. And if you want to learn more about me and stay up to date on the games I'm playing, give me a follow on Facebook and Instagram at clutchkittengaming and on Twitter at KKG Podcast. I'll be honest, I've focused primarily on Instagram recently, so that's the best place to find me, but I am hoping to get more on board with the Twitter train as I figure that whole platform out. I hope you have a stellar rest of your day, and I'll see you in-game.